The tin plate shattered against the floor, spilling stew across Clara Whitmore's worn boots. Laughter exploded through the saloon, harsh cutting, merciless. "Maybe if she didn't eat so much, we'd have food left," someone shouted. Clara's hands trembled as she bent to clean the mess, tears burning behind her eyes. But then the door crashed open. A mountain of a man filled the frame, his shadow swallowing the lamplight. The laughter died. Silas Grayborn had arrived, and everything was about to change. Stay with me until the end of this story and comment what city you're watching from so I can see how far this tale has traveled. The wind that swept through Broken Ridge, Wyoming in the autumn of 1872 carried more than the smell of pine and coming snow. It carried judgment. It carried the weight of 1,000 cruel glances, whispered insults, and the particular kind of loneliness that settles into your bones when the world has decided you're not worth loving. Clara Whitmore knew that wind intimately. She'd felt it every day of her 24 years, but never more keenly than in the kitchen of Patterson's boarding house, where she spent 14 hours a day scrubbing pots, peeling potatoes, and pretending she couldn't hear what people said about her. Lord above, she's gotten bigger. Mrs. Patterson's voice drifted through the serving window that Thursday evening. "I swear that girl eats more than she cooks." Clara's hands stilled in the dishwater soap suds clinging to her reddened fingers. She didn't eat more. She barely ate at all, surviving on the scraps others left behind, the burned edges of bread, the vegetables too wilted for the paying customers. But the truth had never mattered when people looked at her body and made their assumptions. "She'll never find a husband," another voice chimed in. Miss Sarah Hendricks, the banker's daughter, whose waist was so tiny men composed poetry about it. "What man would want all that?" The laughter that followed was like glass grinding into Clara's chest. She was used to it. That was perhaps the worst part, how utterly, completely used to it she'd become. The stares when she walked down Main Street, the way cowboys would nudge each other and snicker when she brought their meals. The preacher's wife, who'd once told her with syrupy, false kindness that gluttony was a sin, and perhaps Clara should pray harder about her affliction. Her affliction. As if her body were a disease. As if she'd chosen to be born into flesh that the world found offensive. Clara pulled her hands from the water and dried them on her apron, the coarse fabric already stained with grease and gravy from the evening meal. Through the window, she could see the dining room of Patterson's, the closest thing Broken Ridge had to a respectable restaurant. Miners sat shoulder to shoulder with ranch hands, while merchants and their wives occupied the better tables near the stone fireplace. It was a Thursday, which meant the place was packed. Thursdays brought the cattle buyers through town, men with money to spend and appetites to match. Mrs. Patterson loved Thursdays. Clara dreaded them. "Girl!" The shout came from the dining room. "Where's our goddamn food?" Clara flinched. She recognized that voice, Jake Holloway, one of the roughest cowboys in the territory. He and his friends had made a game of tormenting her over the past few months, each visit worse than the last. "Coming," she called back, her voice smaller than she wanted it to be. She loaded 3 plates onto a tray. Elk steaks, roasted potatoes, thick slices of bread still warm from the oven. The tray was heavy, but Clara had grown strong from this work, even if nobody could see that strength beneath the softness of her body. The moment she pushed through the kitchen door, she felt the shift in the room's energy. Conversations didn't stop exactly, but they changed. Voices dropped to murmurs, eyes tracked her movement. "Well, well," Jake drawled as she approached his table. "Here comes the wagon." His companions erupted in laughter. One of them, a thin man named Pete, with a face like a weasel, slapped the table. "More like a whole damn freight train." Clara set the plates down with shaking hands, careful not to spill anything. She'd learned that any mistake, any dropped fork or splashed gravy, would be blamed on her clumsiness, her size, her unworthiness to exist in polite company. "Thank you," she whispered, already turning to leave. "Hold on there, Clara." Jake's hand shot out, grabbing her wrist. Not hard enough to hurt, but firm enough to stop her. "You trying to run off without giving us proper service?" Her heart hammered against her ribs. I brought your food, Mr. Holloway." "But you didn't smile." He grinned up at her, showing tobacco-stained teeth. "Ain't a lady supposed to smile when she serves a gentleman?" "Let her go, Jake." The voice came from a nearby table. Old Thomas, a retired ranch hand who'd always been kind to Clara, but his voice was tired, defeated. He knew how this would end. "I'm just having a conversation with the lady," Jake said, his grip tightening slightly. "Though I use that term loosely. Can't really call something a lady when it's built like a—" The door crashed open. The sound was so sudden, so violent, that it cut through every conversation in the room. The heavy oak door, which usually swung open with a creak, had been shoved with such force that it slammed against the wall, rattling the windows in their frames. A man stood in the doorway. No, not just a man. A presence. A force of nature given human form. He was massive, easily 6.5 feet tall, with shoulders that seemed too broad for any normal door frame. His hair was dark, almost black, shot through with silver despite a face that couldn't have seen more than 35 winters. A thick beard covered his jaw, and his eyes, Claire could see them even from across the room, were the pale gray of a winter storm. He wore buckskin and fur, the clothes of a mountain man, and he carried with him the smell of pine snow and wood smoke. A hunting knife hung at his belt, and across his back was a rifle that looked more like a small cannon. But it wasn't his size or his weapons that made the entire dining room fall silent. It was the way he looked at them, like he was assessing threats. Like every person in that room was being measured and judged and found wanting. Jake's hand fell away from Clara's wrist. The man's gaze swept the room, once cataloging faces and positions, before settling on Mrs. Patterson, who stood behind her counter with her mouth hanging open. "Ma'am." His voice was deep rough from disuse, like distant thunder. "I need a meal and information about boarding for the night." Mrs. Patterson recovered quickly, smoothing her apron and putting on her business smile. Of course, we have a fine room available, Mr. Grayborn, Silas Grayborn." A ripple went through the room. Clara saw men exchange glances, heard the sharp intake of breath from Miss Hendricks. Even Jake Holloway had gone pale. Clara didn't know the name, but she understood its power immediately. This was a man with a reputation. "Mr. Grayborn." Mrs. Patterson's smile had become strained. "Yes, well, I'm sure we can accommodate you. Clara?" She snapped her fingers. "Show Mr. Grayborn to table 4 and bring him the evening special." Clara jumped, nearly dropping her empty tray. The table Mrs. Patterson indicated was in the corner away from the fire, the worst table in the house. But as Clara glanced at Silas Grayborn, she saw something flicker in those storm-gray eyes. Amusement. "Lead the way," he said quietly. Clara's legs felt like water as she walked across the dining room, acutely aware that every eye was on her and on the mountain man following behind. She could hear the whispers starting already. "That's Silas Grayborn. Heard he killed 3 men up in the Bighorns. Lives alone in the high country. They say he's half wild." Clara reached the corner table and gestured to it awkwardly. "Here you are, sir." Silas Grayborn lowered himself into the chair, which creaked under his weight. But instead of dismissing her immediately, he looked up, meeting her eyes directly. It was such a small thing, such an ordinary human gesture. But Clara couldn't remember the last time someone had looked her in the face when speaking to her. Most people's eyes slid away or dropped to her body or fixed on a point somewhere over her shoulder. "Thank you, Ceci," he said. "What's your name?" "See, Clara, sir. Clara Whitmore." "Clara." He said it like he was tasting the word. "That's a good name. Means clear, bright." Something caught in her throat. Nobody had ever said anything kind about her name before. Nobody had said much kind about her at all. "I'll bring your meal right away," she managed. Back in the kitchen, Clara's hand shook as she prepared the plate. Mrs. Patterson swept in her face, flushed with anxiety and something that might have been fear. "Don't linger at his table," she hissed. "Men like that are dangerous, unpredictable. Just bring him his food and stay out of his way." "Yes, ma'am." "And for heaven's sake, don't embarrass me. This is Silas Grayborn. He could kill everyone in that room without breaking a sweat." Clara's hand stilled. "Why would he do that?" "Because men like him don't need reasons," Mrs. Patterson snapped. "They're animals, barely civilized. He lives up in those mountains like a hermit, only comes down when he needs to sell furs or buy supplies. They say he's forgotten how to talk to decent folk." But he'd talked to Clara. He'd looked at her. He'd thanked her. She loaded the plate elk steak, potatoes, bread, and a generous helping of greens and carried it out. The dining room had returned to its usual noise level, but there was a current of tension running beneath it. People kept glancing at the corner table where Silas Grayborn sat still as stone, watching the room with those unsettling eyes. Clara set the plate before him carefully. "Is there anything else you need, sir?" "Sit down." The words were so unexpected that Clara almost didn't understand them. What? Sit down." He gestured to the chair across from him. "You look like you've been on your feet all day." "I can't." Clara glanced toward the kitchen where she could feel Mrs. Patterson's eyes boring into her back. "I have work. 1 minute." His voice was still quiet, but there was something in it that made it impossible to refuse. Not a threat, more like certainty. As if he'd made a decision and the universe would simply bend to accommodate it. Clara sat. The chair felt strange beneath her. She couldn't remember the last time she'd sat in the dining room during service. Her heart pounded so hard she was certain everyone could hear it. Silas Grayborn studied her for a moment, then pushed his plate toward the center of the table. "Have you eaten today?" Yes, sir." "Don't lie." There was no judgment in his voice, just statement of fact. "I've been watching. You brought out 12 plates in the last hour. You haven't taken a break, haven't eaten a bite." Heat flooded Clara's face. "It's not appropriate." "It's not appropriate for a working woman to go hungry." He cut a piece of the elk steak and pushed it onto the bread, making a rough sandwich. Then he slid it across to her. "Eat." Clara stared at the food. Her stomach, which she'd trained to stop growling, suddenly clenched with fierce hunger. When had she last eaten yesterday's noon meal the day before? "I can't take your food," she whispered. "You're not taking it. I'm giving it." He leaned back in his chair. "And I won't eat until you do." It was blackmail gentle, but firm. Clara's hands trembled as she picked up the makeshift sandwich. The first bite exploded with flavor, rich, savory, perfect. She couldn't stop the small sound of pleasure that escaped her throat. Across the table, Silas Grayborn smiled. It was barely visible beneath his beard, just a slight curve of his mouth, but it transformed his face from forbidding to almost kind. "Good," he said simply. Clara ate the sandwich in 6 bites, unable to slow down, unable to be dainty or proper. When she finished, she looked up to find him still watching her, but not with the disgust she expected, with something that looked almost like satisfaction. "Thank you," she breathed. "Clara." Mrs. Patterson's voice cracked across the dining room like a whip. "Get back to work." Clara shot to her feet, nearly knocking over the chair. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean—" "Go on." Silas waved her away. "Before your employer bursts a blood vessel." She fled to the kitchen, her face burning, her heart racing with a confusing mixture of shame and something else. Something warm. Something she was afraid to name. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. Clara washed dishes, brought out meals, endured the usual comments and stares. But she was aware with every nerve in her body of the man sitting in the corner. He ate slowly, methodically, and when he finished, he didn't leave. He sat there nursing a cup of coffee, watching the room with those storm-gray eyes. Watching her. It should have made her uncomfortable. God knew she hated being watched, being assessed, being found lacking. But Silas Grayborn's gaze felt different. He wasn't looking at her body, judging its size and shape. He was looking at her, at the way she moved, the way she worked, the way she endured. He was seeing her. The dining room began to empty as the night grew late. Jake Holloway and his friends were the last to leave, and they made sure to get in one final jab. "Hey, Clara!" Pete called out as they headed for the door. "We got a bet going. How many plates you think you could eat in one sitting? I say at least 20. The laughter that followed was cruel casual, the kind of cruelty that came from men who'd never known what it felt like to be the target of mockery. Clara kept her head down, kept scrubbing the pot in her hands. "That's enough." The voice came from the corner. Quiet, calm, absolutely certain. The laughter died. Jake turned slowly, his face flushing red. "You talking to me?" Silas Grayborn stood. The movement was fluid despite his size predatory. He didn't walk toward Jake so much as he flowed, each step measured and controlled. "The lady's been nothing but courteous to you all evening," Silas said, his voice still quiet. "Yet you've treated her with less respect than you'd give a dog. Why is that?" We were just having fun." Fun. Silas stopped 3 feet from Jake, close enough to be threatening, far enough to not be immediately violent. You think it's fun to mock someone for doing honest work, to insult a woman who's shown you nothing but kindness? Jake's face had gone from red to pale. Up close, he looked small next to Silas Grayborn. They all did. Look, Mountain Man, this ain't your business. I'm making it my business. The words hung in the air, heavy with promise. Clara stood frozen in the kitchen doorway, her hands still dripping dishwater, watching a scene she couldn't quite believe was happening. Nobody defended her. Nobody ever defended her. You apologize to Miss Clara, Silas said. Right now. Or you and I take this conversation outside, and I promise you won't like how it ends. Pete grabbed Jake's arm. Come on, let's just go. But Jake's pride was stronger than his common sense. I ain't apologizing to no... Silas moved faster than a man his size had any right to move. One moment he was standing still. The next his hand was wrapped around Jake's throat, lifting him onto his toes. Not choking him, just holding him there, suspended, helpless. You want to finish that sentence? Silas asked conversationally. Because the next word out of your mouth determines whether you leave here on your feet or on a stretcher. Jake's eyes bulged. He clawed at Silas's hand, but it was like trying to move a mountain. I'm sorry. The words came out strangled, desperate. I'm sorry, Clara. I'm sorry. Silas held him for one more heartbeat, then released him. Jake stumbled backward, gasping, his friends catching him before he fell. Get out, Silas said quietly. And if I hear you've spoken to her that way again, what happens next will make tonight look gentle. They ran. 3 grown men scrambling over each other to get out the door, their boots thundering on the wooden boards. Silence fell over the dining room. Mrs. Patterson stood behind her counter, white as a sheet. The few remaining customers stared at their plates, and Clara stood in the kitchen doorway, her hand pressed to her mouth, tears streaming down her face. Silas turned to look at her. His expression softened. I apologize if I frightened you. Clara shook her head, unable to speak. She wasn't frightened. She was overwhelmed. Nobody had ever, not once in her entire life, stood up for her like that. I think, Mrs. Patterson said, her voice shaking. We're closed for the night. Clara, finish the dishes and then get to your room. It was a dismissal, a way to end this scene, to restore normalcy, to pretend this hadn't happened. Clara nodded mutely and retreated to the kitchen. But as she plunged her hands back into the dishwater, she heard heavy footsteps approaching. She looked up to find Silas Grayborn standing in the kitchen doorway, a canvas bag in his hand. I brought something for you, he said, from the mountains. He set the bag on the counter and opened it. Inside were wild mushrooms, beautiful golden chanterelles, the kind that grew in secret places and tasted like heaven. I noticed you didn't have these in your cooking, Silas said. They're best sautéed in butter with a little garlic, or you can dry them for winter. Clara stared at the mushrooms, then at him. Why what? Why are you being kind to me? The question seemed to puzzle him. He tilted his head slightly, considering. Why wouldn't I be? And there it was. The simplicity that cut through every complicated, painful year of Clara's life. Why wouldn't he be kind, as if kindness were the default, as if cruelty were the aberration that needed explanation? Thank you, Clara whispered, for the mushrooms, and for what you did out there. Those men are cowards. Silas's voice was matter of fact. They need to hurt others to feel strong. You're worth 10 of them. The words landed in Clara's chest like a physical blow. Not from pain, from the shock of hearing something she'd never believed anyone could say about her. I should let you finish your work, Silas said. But I'll be here for a few days, selling furs, buying supplies, if anyone bothers you again. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. He turned to leave, then paused. My room is upstairs, east side. If you need anything at all, you knock on that door. Understand? Clara nodded, not trusting her voice. After he left, she stood alone in the kitchen, her hands in the cooling dishwater, tears falling freely now. She cried for every cruel word she'd endured, for every time she'd been made to feel less than human, for the loneliness that had become so familiar she'd forgotten what it felt like to be seen. And she cried because a stranger, a feared mountain man with a reputation for violence, had shown her more kindness in one evening than she'd received in her entire life. The dishes took another hour to finish. By the time Clara hung up her apron and climbed the narrow stairs to the attic room she rented from Mrs. Patterson, exhaustion had settled into her bones. Her room was tiny, barely large enough for a bed, a washstand, and a small trunk that held all her possessions, but it was hers. She lit the oil lamp and sat on the edge of her bed, pulling off her boots. Her feet ached. Her back ached. Everything ached. This was her life. Work, pain, humiliation. Sleep. Then wake up and do it all again. But tonight felt different. Tonight something had shifted. She thought about Silas Grayborn's words. "You're worth 10 of them." Clara had never been worth anything to anyone. She'd been the burden child, the one her parents had struggled to feed before they died of fever when she was 12. She'd been passed between relatives who made it clear she was unwelcome, a mouth they couldn't afford to feed. By 16, she'd learned to make herself useful, cooking, cleaning, working herself to exhaustion in exchange for room and board and the privilege of being tolerated. She'd never been worth 10 of anyone. Clara lay back on her bed, staring at the rough wooden ceiling. Somewhere below her, in a better room with a real window, Silas Grayborn was probably sleeping. Or maybe he was awake too, listening to the wind rattle the shutters, thinking about the mountains he called home. What would it be like, Clara wondered, to live in a place where the trees didn't judge you, where the streams didn't whisper cruel things as they flowed past, where you could exist without constantly bracing yourself for the next insult? It was a foolish thought, a dangerous thought. Clara had learned long ago not to hope for things beyond her reach. But as she closed her eyes and let sleep pull her under, she couldn't quite extinguish the small, stubborn flame that had been lit in her chest. For the first time in years, Clara Whitmore fell asleep feeling something other than resignation. She fell asleep feeling seen. Clara woke to the sound of Mrs. Patterson's broom handle banging against her door. 3 sharp raps like gunshots in the pre-dawn darkness. "Up, girl. Those breakfast plates won't cook themselves." She dressed in the dark, her fingers fumbling with the buttons of her only other work dress. The fabric was worn thin at the elbows, and there was a stain near the hem that no amount of scrubbing could remove, but it was clean. Claire had learned that cleanliness was the one thing she could control, the one way to push back against the assumption that someone who looked like her must be slovenly, careless, dirty. The kitchen was cold when she arrived. She built up the fire in the big cast-iron stove, her breath misting in the air as she worked. Outside the window, Broken Ridge was still dark, the mountains beyond the town reduced to darker shadows against a charcoal sky. Clara's hands moved through the familiar motions, mixing biscuit dough, slicing bacon, cracking eggs into a bowl. This was the one place she felt competent, the one skill nobody could take from her. She might be fat, ugly, unmarriageable, all the things the world said she was, but she could cook. She could take raw ingredients and transform them into something that made people happy, even if they'd never thank her for it. She was sliding the first batch of biscuits into the oven when she heard footsteps on the stairs, heavy, measured footsteps that made the old boards creak. Silas Grayborn appeared in the kitchen doorway, ducking slightly to clear the frame. He wore the same buckskins as the night before, but his hair was damp, as if he'd washed at the pump in the yard. His eyes found hers immediately. "Morning," he said. "Good morning, Mr. Grayborn." Clara's voice came out steadier than she expected. "Breakfast won't be ready for another 20 minutes, but I can bring you coffee if you'd like." "I'd like that. And it's Silas." That wouldn't be proper." "Clara." He said her name the way he'd said it last night, like it meant something. "I spent the last 8 years living alone on a mountain. I've forgotten most of what's proper. Humor me." Despite herself, Clara felt the corner of her mouth twitch, almost a smile. "Coffee then, Silas." She poured him a cup from the pot that was always on the stove, adding a splash of cream the way she'd seen him take it the night before. When she handed it to him, their fingers brushed for just a moment. His hands were rough, calloused, marked with old scars. Working hands. Honest hands. "You're up early," Clara said, turning back to her work so she wouldn't have to meet those storm-gray eyes. "Mountain habit. Sun comes up, you're awake." He leaned against the doorframe, cradling the coffee cup in both hands. "Besides, I wanted to talk to you before the house woke up." Clara's heart lurched. "If this is about last night, I want to thank you again. What you did, nobody's ever—" "That's not what I want to talk about." Silas took a slow sip of coffee. "Though those men deserved worse than they got, No, I wanted to ask you something about your work here. My work. You're paid fair wages, you have a contract. Clara's hands stilled in the dough she was kneading. The question was so unexpected, so direct, that she didn't know how to answer. Mrs. Patterson provides room and board, and a small wage. It's enough. How much? Mr. Gray. Mr. Gray. Silas, I don't think. How much? There was no anger in his voice, but there was something immovable, like asking a mountain to shift aside. $3 a month, Clara admitted quietly. Plus my room and meals. Silas was silent for a long moment. When Clara glanced up, she saw something dark pass across his face. $3, he repeated. For 14-hour days, 6 days a week. That comes out to about 5 cents a day. It's fair, Clara said automatically, because that's what Mrs. Patterson always told her. I'm lucky to have the position at all, considering... She stopped herself, but not quickly enough. Considering what? Considering nobody else would hire me. The words came out bitter sharp. Clara pressed her lips together, horrified at herself. She never talked like this. Never let the anger out where anyone could see it. But Silas didn't look shocked or disapproving. He just nodded slowly. Because of how you look. It wasn't a question. Clara turned away, attacking the dough with unnecessary force. People have expectations, standards. I don't meet them. So yes, I'm grateful for any work I can get. Grateful. Silas said the word like it tasted bad. You're one of the hardest workers I've ever seen. You move through this kitchen like a dancer. You've got skill, talent, intelligence, and you're grateful for scraps. Clara's throat tightened. You don't understand how it is. I understand that you've been told lies so many times you've started to believe them. Silas set down his coffee cup. I understand that people in this town see what you look like and decide they know everything about who you are. I understand that because the same thing happens to me. Clara looked up at that. You heard what they said last night. Half wild, dangerous, an animal. I come down from those mountains and people look at me like I might snap at any moment, like I've forgotten how to be civilized. He smiled, but there was no humor in it. Maybe I have, but at least I'm honest about what I am. These people wrap their cruelty in manners and call it decency. The biscuits needed to come out. Clara grabbed a towel and pulled the pan from the oven, grateful for the excuse to turn away from his penetrating gaze. She could feel tears building behind her eyes, and she refused to cry in front of him again. Why are you telling me this? She asked quietly. Because I recognize something in you, something I used to see in my own mirror. Silas moved closer, though he was careful not to crowd her. You're trapped, not by chains or bars, but by what other people have convinced you is possible. And I'm here to tell you that's horseshit. Clara actually gasped. She'd never heard such language from a man speaking directly to her. Silas continued unrepentant. You want to know what I did when I realized the world had decided who I was supposed to be? I left. Walked away from every expectation, every judgment, every person who thought they knew me better than I knew myself. Went up into those mountains and built a life on my own terms. I can't just leave, Clara protested. I have responsibilities, obligations. To who? To a woman who pays you 5 cents a day and lets her customers mock you. To a town that treats you like you're less than human. Silas's voice remained calm, but there was steel beneath it. You don't owe them anything, Clara. Not a damn thing. The kitchen door swung open, and Mrs. Patterson bustled in, her face already pinched with morning irritation. She stopped short when she saw Silas, her expression flickering between fear and forced politeness. Mr. Grayborn, I didn't realize you were awake. Clara, why didn't you tell me we had a guest? I came down early, Silas said smoothly. Wanted coffee and conversation. Miss Clara here has been most accommodating. Mrs. Patterson's eyes narrowed. Clara has work to do. The other guests will be down soon expecting breakfast. Of course. Silas picked up his coffee cup. I'll get out of your way. Thank you for the coffee, Clara. And for the conversation. He left, but his words lingered in the kitchen like smoke. Mrs. Patterson rounded on Clara the moment he was gone. What did he want? Just coffee, ma'am. What were you talking about? Nothing important. Mountains and such. Mrs. Patterson stepped closer, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. You listen to me, girl. I saw how you looked at him last night. Don't get ideas. Men like Silas Grayborn don't have time for women like you. He was being kind, that's all. Don't mistake kindness for interest. Each word was a small knife, precise and cutting. Clara had heard variations of this speech her entire life. Don't get ideas, know your place, accept your limitations. Yes, ma'am, she said, because it was easier than arguing. But as Mrs. Patterson left to tend to the dining room, Clara found herself thinking about Silas's words. You don't owe them anything. Could that be true? Could she really just leave? The breakfast service passed in its usual chaos. Clara cooked, served, cleaned, and endured. But she was aware with every nerve in her body of Silas sitting at his corner table. He ate slowly, reading a week-old newspaper someone had left behind. Every so often, she'd feel his eyes on her watching, assessing. It should have made her uncomfortable. Instead, it made her stand a little straighter, move a little more confidently, as if his gaze was a reminder that she was more than what this town believed. Jake Holloway didn't come in for breakfast. Neither did his friends. Clara didn't know if she was relieved or disappointed. Part of her wanted them to show up, wanted to see if last night had changed anything, if fear of Silas Grayborn might translate into basic human decency. But she knew better. Men like Jake didn't learn. They just got more careful about when and where they showed their true nature. Around mid-morning, after the breakfast dishes were done and the lunch preparations begun, Mrs. Patterson called Clara into the dining room. The older woman stood behind the counter, her arms crossed, her face set in grim lines. I've been thinking about last night, Mrs. Patterson said, and I've decided it would be best if you didn't work the dining room for a few days. Clara's stomach dropped. Ma'am, you caused a scene. Whether you meant to or not, you disrupted my establishment, frightened my customers. That cowboy and his friends are good-paying customers, and now they might not come back. I didn't do anything, Clara protested. They were the ones. It doesn't matter what they did. It matters what happened. Mrs. Patterson's voice was flat final. You'll work in the kitchen only, no contact with guests, and your wages will be reduced by $1 this month to compensate for the trouble. $1, a third of her already meager pay. That's not fair, Clara said, and was shocked by the strength in her own voice. Mrs. Patterson's eyebrows rose. Excuse me. I said that's not fair. I've worked here for 3 years. I've never missed a day. I've never complained. And you're punishing me because a customer defended me from harassment. I'm punishing you for forgetting your place. Mrs. Patterson leaned forward, her voice dropping to a venomous whisper. You seem to have forgotten what you are, Clara Whitmore. You're not some princess who deserves defending. You're a fat, unmarriageable woman who should be grateful anyone tolerates her presence at all. Now get back to work before I decide you're more trouble than you're worth. Clara stood frozen, the words hitting her like physical blows. She'd heard worse. God knew she'd heard worse, but somehow, coming from a woman who'd employed her for years, they cut deeper. She turned and walked back to the kitchen on numb legs. Her hands shook as she picked up a knife to chop vegetables for the lunch stew. The blade blurred through her tears. Don't get ideas, know your place. Accept your limitations. But beneath the old familiar pain, something else was stirring. Something that felt like anger. Clean, bright, righteous anger. Silas Grayborn's words echoed in her mind. You don't owe them anything. Clara was still chopping vegetables when she heard the kitchen door open behind her. She didn't turn around, didn't want anyone to see she'd been crying. Clara? It was Silas. Of course it was Silas. I'm working, she said, keeping her voice steady. I'm not supposed to talk to guests. Why not? Mrs. Patterson's orders. After last night, I'm to stay in the kitchen, out of sight. Silence. Then, did she punish you? Clara's hand stilled on the cutting board. She could lie. She should lie. It wasn't proper to complain about her employer to a guest. But she was so tired of lying. She reduced my wages, Clara said quietly. $1 for the month, for causing a disturbance. She heard Silas take a slow, deep breath. When he spoke again, his voice was carefully controlled. You caused nothing. Those men harassed you. I intervened. The only disturbance was the one they created. It doesn't matter. I'm the one who pays the price. Clara set down the knife and finally turned to face him. That's how it works. People like me don't get to fight back. We don't get to demand fairness. We take what we're given and we're grateful for it. People like you. Fat people. Ugly people. People nobody wants. The words poured out of her now bitter and sharp. Do you know what it's like going through life knowing you're a burden? Knowing that every space you occupy, someone wishes you weren't there. Every meal you eat, someone's calculating how much it costs to feed you. Every kindness shown to you is noted as exceptional, as going above and beyond what you deserve. Silas crossed the kitchen in 3 long strides. He didn't touch her, but he was close enough that she could smell pine and wood smoke, could see the silver threading through his dark hair. I know exactly what that's like, he said quietly. I told you people look at me and see a monster, something to fear, something dangerous. I see the way women cross the street when I walk past, the way men put their hands on their guns, the way children hide behind their mothers' skirts. That's different, Clara protested. You could hurt them if you wanted. You're strong, powerful. And you think you're not. Silas's eyes bored into hers. You've survived 24 years in a world that told you every single day that you shouldn't exist. You work yourself to exhaustion for people who treat you like dirt. You endure insults and mockery and cruelty, and you still get up the next morning and do it all again. If that's not strength, I don't know what is. Clara opened her mouth to argue, but no words came out. Because somewhere deep inside, in a place she'd locked away years ago, something recognized the truth in what he was saying. I came down here to sell furs, Silas continued. But I'm also here because winter's coming, and I needed to remember why I prefer the mountains to civilization. Usually takes about 2 days in town before I remember. People and their rules and their judgments and their small petty cruelties. He paused. But then I met you, and I thought maybe there's one person in this godforsaken town worth knowing. Why me? Clara whispered. Why do you care what happens to me? Silas was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was rough. 8 years ago, I had a wife. Her name was Sarah. She was small and delicate and beautiful, everything the world said a woman should be. We lived in Denver. I worked as a blacksmith. We were happy. Clara waited, sensing this was a story Silas didn't tell often. She got pregnant. We were excited, scared all the things new parents are supposed to feel. But the pregnancy was difficult. She was sick all the time, couldn't keep food down. The doctor said it was normal, that it would pass. Silas's jaw tightened. It didn't pass. She got weaker, thinner. I begged her to rest, to take care of herself, but she was so worried about being a burden, about not being able to do her wifely duties, about disappointing me. Clara's heart clenched. She died 6 months in, her and the baby both. Silas's voice was flat now, emotionless, in the way of deep pain. The doctor said if she'd rested more, eaten more, taken better care of herself, they might have survived. But she'd been so convinced she didn't deserve to take up space, didn't deserve to ask for help, that she worked herself to death, trying to be what everyone expected. I'm so sorry, Clara breathed. After she died, I couldn't stay in that city. Couldn't stand the sight of all those people who'd made her feel like she was never enough. So I left. Went to the mountains where the only expectations are survival. He looked at Clara with those storm-gray eyes. And when I saw you last night bending down to clean up that mess while men laughed at you, I saw Sarah. Saw the way she'd make herself small, apologize for existing. And I thought, not again. I won't watch another woman destroy herself trying to meet the world's impossible standards. Tears were streaming down Clara's face now, and she didn't care. I don't know how to be anything else. Yes, you do. Silas's voice was gentle but firm. You know how to survive, how to work, how to endure. Now you just need to learn how to live. How? The question came out broken, desperate. How do I do that? First, you stop letting people like Mrs. Patterson steal your wages for crimes you didn't commit. Silas turned toward the kitchen door. Stay here. What are you going to do? Have a conversation about fair business practices. Before Clara could protest, he was gone. She stood alone in the kitchen, her heart pounding, torn between hope and terror. What was he doing? He shouldn't. Raised voices drifted from the dining room, Mrs. Patterson's shrill protests, Silas's lower, calmer responses. Clara couldn't make out the words, but she didn't need to. She could imagine the conversation well enough. 5 minutes later, Silas returned. He pulled a small leather pouch from his pocket and set it on the counter next to Clara's cutting board. "What's this?" she asked. "Your wages. Full amount for the month plus the dollar she tried to steal, plus a bonus for exceptional service under difficult circumstances." Silas's expression was grim. "Mrs. Patterson and I came to an understanding. She won't be reducing your pay, and she won't be punishing you for last night's incident." Clara stared at the pouch. What did you say to her?" "I reminded her that word travels fast in towns like this. If people heard she was cheating her workers, her reputation would suffer. Then I mentioned that I'd be staying in Broken Ridge for at least a week, and I'd be very interested in where I took my meals during that time." Silas smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Turns out her principles are negotiable when her profits are at stake. Clara picked up the pouch with trembling hands. It was heavier than any pay she'd ever received. "You didn't have to do this." "Yes, I did." Silas leaned against the counter. "But this is just a temporary fix, Clara. You know that, right? Next month, next year, she'll find another way to take from you, to make you feel small, unless you change something fundamental." "I can't just leave," Clara said, but her voice lacked conviction now. "I have nowhere to go, no skills beyond cooking and cleaning, no one who would hire me." "You could come with me." The words hung in the air between them, impossible and tempting. Clara laughed, but it came out choked. "To the mountains, to live alone with a man I barely know." "That's insane." "Probably," Silas agreed. "But is it more insane than staying here, spending the rest of your life being paid pennies to feed people who treat you like garbage?" He pushed away from the counter. "I'm not asking you to marry me, Clara. I'm not asking for anything inappropriate. I'm offering you a job. A real job with fair pay and decent treatment." "Doing what?" "I need help, the kind of help you can provide." Silas ticked off on his fingers. "Someone who can preserve food for winter. Someone who can cook proper meals instead of the slop I make for myself. Someone who knows how to turn a rough cabin into something livable. I live off the land, Clara, but I'm not good at the domestic side of things. Sarah used to handle all that, and since she died..." He trailed off. "I survive, but I don't live well." Clara's mind was racing. "You're serious. You're actually serious. Dead serious. I'll pay you $10 a month. Your own room in the cabin, separate from mine, properly private. You keep half of any profits from the preserves and smoked meats we make. Come spring, if you want to leave, I'll bring you back down to town with enough money saved to go wherever you want. Start fresh somewhere new." It was too much, too fast, too impossible. "I need time to think," Clara said. "Take all the time you need." Silas moved toward the door, then paused. "But Clara, don't confuse thinking with finding reasons to stay trapped. Fear always has more arguments than courage." He left her alone in the kitchen, surrounded by half-chopped vegetables and the weight of an impossible choice. The rest of the day passed in a fog. Clara cooked clean, served meals to the lunch crowd. Mrs. Patterson avoided her, which was almost worse than the woman's usual sharp criticisms. It meant something had changed. It meant the foundation of Clara's small, painful world had shifted. That evening, after the dinner service was done and the kitchen cleaned, Clara didn't immediately retreat to her attic room. Instead, she found herself walking through the quiet streets of Broken Ridge. The sun had set an hour ago, and lamplight spilled from windows onto the dusty road. She could hear laughter from the saloon, the tinny sound of an out-of-tune piano. She walked past the general store, the bank, the small white church with its crooked steeple. This was the world she knew, the only world she'd ever known. Small, cramped, cruel, but familiar, safe in its predictability. What would it be like to leave all this behind? Clara found herself at the edge of town where the buildings gave way to wilderness. The mountains rose in the distance, dark shapes against a star-scattered sky. Somewhere up there, Silas Grayborn had built a life without judgment, without cruelty, without the constant weight of other people's expectations. Could she really do it? Could she really just go, "Evening, Miss Clara"? She jumped, her heart leaping into her throat. A man emerged from the shadows near the old livery stable. For a terrifying moment, she thought it might be Jake Holloway come for revenge. But it was old Thomas, the retired ranch hand, who'd tried to defend her the night before. He carried a kerosene lamp in one gnarled hand. "You startled me," Clara said, pressing a hand to her chest. "Sorry about that. Saw you walking alone and wanted to make sure you were all right." Thomas came closer, his weathered face kind in the lamplight. "You shouldn't be out here by yourself after dark. Not safe for a young woman." "I'm fine, just needed some air." Thomas nodded slowly. "Heard what happened today. Mrs. Patterson running her mouth about you being punished. Then heard Silas Grayborn had words with her." He smiled. "Whole town's buzzing about it." Clara's stomach sank. Of course they were. In a town this small, everyone knew everything. "They're saying he's taken an interest in you," Thomas continued. "Some folks think it's romantic. Others think it's, well, less respectable." "It's neither," Clara said quietly. "He's just being kind." "That man doesn't do anything without a reason. I've known Silas Grayborn for near 15 years. He's not the monster people make him out to be, but he's not given to random acts of charity either." Clara looked at the old man carefully. "You know him?" "Used to work with him back before he went to the mountains. We were both at the Harrison Ranch about 30 miles north of here. I was the foreman. He was one of the hands. Best worker I ever had, strong, smart, didn't complain. But he was different even then, quieter than most men. More thoughtful." "What made him leave?" Thomas's expression grew sad. "His wife died. Beautiful little thing, too delicate for this hard world. After she passed, Silas couldn't stand being around people anymore. Said civilization had killed her with its expectations and judgments. So he left. Built a cabin up in the high country and only comes down when he needs supplies." The story matched what Silas had told her, which meant he'd been telling the truth. Not that Clara had doubted him, but confirmation from an outside source made it more real somehow. "He offered me a job," Clara said suddenly. The words were out before she could stop them. Thomas's eyebrows rose. "Did he now?" "Cooking, preserving food, keeping house. He said he'd pay me $10 a month plus room and board." "That's more than fair wages for that kind of work." "I know." Clara wrapped her arms around herself. "But I'd have to go with him. To the mountains. Live in his cabin. And that scares you." It wasn't a question. Clara nodded anyway. "Everyone would think they'd assume people are going to think what they want to think regardless of what you do," Thomas said gently. "You could live like a saint and they'd still find something to criticize. That's the nature of small towns and smaller minds." "But is it safe going off alone with a man I barely know?" Thomas was quiet for a long moment. "I can't answer that for you, Miss Clara. All I can tell you is that in the 2 years I worked with Silas Grayborn, I never saw him raise a hand to anyone who didn't deserve it. Never heard him say a cruel word to a woman. He's rough around the edges, yes, and he's killed men, but always in fair fights, always when he had no choice." "That's not exactly reassuring." "No, I suppose it's not." Thomas shifted his weight. "But I can also tell you this, if Silas Grayborn gave you his word that you'd be safe, that he'd treat you with respect, then you would be. He's many things, but he's not a liar." Clara turned back toward the mountains hidden now in the darkness. "I don't know what to do." "Well, that's the beautiful and terrible thing about being alive," Thomas said. "We have to make choices even when we don't know which way is right. But I'll tell you what I told my own daughter before she left for San Francisco. Sometimes the scariest path is the one that leads to freedom." He tipped his hat to her and walked away, leaving Clara alone with her thoughts and the distant mountains. She stood there for a long time, feeling the night breeze on her face, listening to the sounds of the town settling in for sleep. Behind her was everything she knew, cruel and small and suffocating but known. Ahead was the unknown, wild and dangerous and free. "You don't owe them anything," Silas had said. And standing there in the darkness, Clara finally understood what he meant. She didn't owe Mrs. Patterson her youth and her health and her dignity. She didn't owe the people of Broken Ridge her suffering as payment for the privilege of existing. She didn't owe the world the right to make her small. She owed herself a life, a real life, not just survival. Clara turned and walked back toward Patterson's boarding house, her steps more certain than they'd been in years. She didn't know yet what she would decide, but she knew with absolute clarity that the decision was hers to make. Nobody else's, just hers. And that realization, terrifying as it was, felt like freedom. The decision came 3 days later, though. In her heart, Clara had known from that first night what she would do. Fear had just needed time to exhaust its arguments. It was Sunday morning, and Mrs. Patterson had given Clara permission to attend services at the small white church on the edge of town. Clara rarely went. The preacher's wife had made it clear that her presence was tolerated rather than welcomed. But this Sunday felt different, important, like she needed to mark the ending of one life before beginning another. She wore her best dress, a dark blue calico, that she'd sewn herself from fabric bought with 3 months of saved wages. It was the only garment she owned that hadn't been mended a dozen times, and she'd made it carefully precisely with secret hope that someday she might wear it somewhere that mattered. The church was half full when Clara slipped into the back pew. She could feel eyes on her, hear the whispers. The story of Silas Grayborn defending her had spread through Broken Ridge like wildfire, growing more scandalous with each retelling. By now, half the town believed they were having an affair. The other half thought she was a fool being led into danger by a violent man. Nobody considered that she might simply be making a choice about her own life. The preacher's sermon that morning was about contentment, about accepting one's lot in life as God's will, about the sin of coveting what others had. Clara sat in her pew and felt each word like a stone being added to a wall meant to keep her trapped. When the service ended, she didn't immediately leave. She sat there as the congregation filed out their Sunday clothes, rustling their voices, carrying on about weather and business, and whose daughter was courting whom. Normal life. Safe life. The kind of life Clara had always been on the edges of looking in. Clara Whitmore. She looked up to find Preacher Morrison standing in the aisle, his wife beside him. Mrs. Morrison was a thin woman with a pinched face and eyes that always seemed to be calculating the moral failings of everyone around her. "Yes, preacher." Clara stood smoothing her skirt nervously. "I've been hearing troubling things about you," he said, his voice carrying that particular tone of concern that masked judgment. "About your association with the mountain man." Clara's spine stiffened. "Mr. Grayborn has been nothing but kind to me." Kindness from such a man often comes with expectations. Mrs. Morrison said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "We worry for your soul, dear, for your reputation. People are talking." "People are always talking," Clara said, and was surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. "They've been talking about me my whole life. I'm used to it." "But this is different," Preacher Morrison insisted. "This affects your moral standing, your place in the community. If you continue this association, you'll be seen as a fallen woman." Something inside Clara snapped. Maybe it was the 3 days of thinking, of weighing her options, of measuring her life against what it could be. Maybe it was the memory of Silas's words about not owing the world her suffering. Maybe it was simply that she'd reached the end of her capacity to make herself small for other people's comfort. "Fallen," she repeated quietly. "That's interesting. When Jake Holloway and his friends mock me in public, humiliate me, make me feel less than human. Where's the concern for my moral standing?" Then, when Mrs. Patterson pays me 5 cents a day for 14 hours of work, where's the outrage about Christian charity? When your wife tells me that my body is an affliction, I should pray away. Where's the compassion that Jesus commanded? Mrs. Morrison's face went red. "How dare you? I've spent my entire life trying to earn the respect of this community," Clara continued, her voice gaining strength. "I've worked myself to exhaustion. I've endured insults and cruelty without complaint. I've made myself as invisible as possible, taken up as little space as I could, apologized for existing. And what did it get me? Nothing, less than nothing. Because no matter what I do, no matter how good or quiet or useful I am, people still look at me and see only what's wrong with me." "Clara, you're being hysterical," Preacher Morrison said. "No, for the first time in my life, I'm being clear." Clara picked up her shawl from the pew. "Silas Grayborn offered me honest work at fair wages. He's treated me with more kindness and respect in 3 days than this entire town has shown me in 24 years. So if my accepting his offer makes me fallen in your eyes, then I'll fall. I'll fall as far from this place as I can get." She walked past them, her head high, her hands trembling only slightly. Behind her, she could hear Mrs. Morrison's outraged sputtering, the preacher's calls for her to come back and apologize. But Clara didn't stop. She walked out of that church and into the bright autumn sunlight, and it felt like being born. The walk back to Patterson's boarding house took less than 10 minutes, but it felt like crossing a continent. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. What had she just done? She'd burned her bridges, destroyed what little standing she had in the community, made herself truly outcast, and she felt alive. Mrs. Patterson was in the kitchen when Clara arrived, preparing the Sunday dinner that would be served in 2 hours. The older woman looked up, her expression sour. "You're late. Those potatoes need peeling, and I quit," Clara said. The words hung in the air. Mrs. Patterson's mouth fell open. "What did you say?" "I quit." Clara untied her shawl and folded it carefully. "I'm giving you notice. I'll work through the end of the week to give you time to find a replacement, but then I'm leaving." This is about that mountain man, isn't it?" Mrs. Patterson's face flushed with anger and something that might have been fear. "He's put ideas in your head, convinced you to abandon your responsibilities. He offered me a better life than this. Fair wages, decent treatment, honest work. I'm taking it." "You foolish girl." Mrs. Patterson slammed her hand on the counter. "Do you have any idea what you're throwing away? You have security here, stability. Out there with him, you'll have nothing. When he tires of you, when he throws you out, you'll come crawling back here begging for your job, and I won't take you back." Clara met the older woman's eyes steadily. "I'm counting on that." Something in her tone made Mrs. Patterson step back. For the first time in 3 years, Clara saw something in the woman's face besides disdain or irritation. She saw uncertainty, maybe even a trace of fear. "You'll regret this," Mrs. Patterson said, but her voice had lost its edge. "Maybe," Clara agreed, "but at least I'll regret my own choices instead of regretting that I never made any." She walked out of the kitchen and climbed the narrow stairs to her attic room. Once inside, she sat on the edge of her bed and let the shaking take her. Her hands trembled, her breath came in short gasps, and for a moment she thought she might be sick. She'd done it. She'd actually done it. Quit her job, told off the preacher, committed herself to leaving the only life she'd ever known. Terror and exhilaration warred in her chest. A knock at her door made her jump. "Yes, it's me." Silas's voice low and steady. "Can I come in?" Clara stood and opened the door. Silas stood in the narrow hallway, his head bent to avoid the low ceiling, his expression concerned. "I heard you had an interesting morning," he said. "Word travels fast. In a town this size, like wildfire." He studied her face. "Are you all right?" Clara laughed, and it came out slightly unhinged. "I don't know. I just quit my job, insulted the preacher and his wife, and committed to moving to the mountains with a man I've known for 3 days. So either I'm better than I've ever been, or I've lost my mind completely." "Could be both," Silas said, and there was a hint of smile in his voice. "Does this mean you've decided—" "Yes." Clara took a deep breath. "Yes, I'll come with you. I'll take the job. Her voice cracked. "I'll try to be brave enough for this." "You're already brave enough." Silas leaned against the doorframe. "It takes more courage to change your life than it does to let it continue as it is. You've already done the hard part. When do we leave?" "I need 3 more days to finish my business in town. Sell the last of my furs, buy supplies for winter. Can you be ready by Thursday morning?" Thursday, 4 days from now, 4 days until her entire life changed. "I'll be ready," Clara said. The next 3 days passed in a strange blur of heightened reality. Clara worked her final shifts in the kitchen with a kind of focused intensity, as if trying to memorize every detail. The weight of the cast iron skillet, the smell of bread baking, the particular way the morning light fell through the window above the sink. Mrs. Patterson barely spoke to her, which was almost a mercy. The silent treatment was easier to bear than the cutting remarks would have been. The few words they did exchange were purely functional instructions about meals, notifications about supply deliveries, but the rest of the town had plenty to say. By Monday afternoon, everyone in Broken Ridge knew that Clara Whitmore was leaving with Silas Grayborn. The story had taken on a life of its own, growing more dramatic with each retelling. Some said she was eloping with him despite being unmarried. Others claimed he'd kidnapped her or put her under some kind of spell. A few suggested she was running from some dark secret, some crime she'd committed. Nobody seemed to consider that she was simply taking a job. Clara endured the stares and whispers as she'd endured them her whole life by keeping her head down and focusing on her work. But now, instead of the shame and humiliation she'd always felt, there was something different, a kind of grim satisfaction. These people had made her life miserable, and now she was leaving. Their opinions couldn't reach her where she was going. Tuesday evening, old Thomas stopped by the kitchen with a gift, a warm wool blanket his late wife had made thick and beautifully woven. "For the mountain winters," he said gruffly. "They're colder than anything you've experienced down here." Clara accepted the blanket with tears in her eyes. "Thank you. This is too generous." "Nonsense. My Sarah would have wanted you to have it." Thomas patted her shoulder awkwardly. "You're doing the right thing, girl. Don't let anyone tell you different." Wednesday brought an unexpected visitor. Clara was in her room packing her few belongings when she heard footsteps on the attic stairs. She opened the door to find Miss Sarah Hendricks standing there looking uncomfortable and out of place in the shabby hallway. "Miss Hendricks," Clara said, unable to hide her surprise. "Can I help you?" Sarah fidgeted with her lace gloves. "I wanted to apologize for what I said, about you never finding a husband, about all of it." Clara leaned against the doorframe, studying the other woman. Sarah was beautiful, petite, everything the world said a woman should be. But right now she looked small in a different way, diminished. "Why?" Clara asked. "Because it was cruel. Because you didn't deserve it." Sarah's voice dropped to almost a whisper. "Because I'm jealous. Jealous of me, of your freedom." Sarah looked up and there were tears in her eyes. "My father has arranged my marriage to Thomas Blackwell, the banker from Cheyenne. He's 47 years old and he has 4 children from his first wife. I don't love him. I don't even like him. But I have to marry him because that's what women like me do. We're decorative, useful for making connections and bearing children. We don't get to choose." Clara felt an unexpected surge of sympathy. "I'm sorry." "Don't be. It's my own fault for being too afraid to be anything else." Sarah managed a weak smile. "You're braver than I am, Clara Whitmore. I hope you find happiness up there in those mountains." After Sarah left, Clara sat on her bed with the blue calico dress in her hands. She'd worn it to church, thinking it was her best dress, her most proper dress. But looking at it now, she realized it was just another uniform, another way of trying to fit herself into a space that was never meant to hold her. She folded it carefully and set it aside. She wouldn't take it with her. Thursday morning arrived with frost on the ground and a sky so clear it hurt to look at. Clara woke before dawn dressed in her warmest work dress and the sturdy boots she used for kitchen duty. She packed her few belongings into an old carpet bag. 2 changes of clothes, the leather pouch of wages Silas had secured for her old Thomas's blanket, and the small Bible her mother had given her before she died. Everything she owned in the world fit in one bag. She was carrying it down the stairs when she met Mrs. Patterson in the hallway. The older woman looked like she'd aged 10 years in the past week, her face drawn and tired. "So you're really doing this?" Mrs. Patterson said. "Yes, ma'am." "I hope you know what you're getting into. Mountain life is hard, unforgiving, and men like Silas Grayborn." She stopped herself. "Well, you've made your choice." Clara paused on the stairs. Part of her wanted to leave without another word, to simply walk away from this place and never look back. But another part, the part that still remembered kindness even in cruel places, made her speak. "Thank you for employing me these past 3 years," she said quietly. "I know I wasn't the worker you wanted, but I tried my best." Mrs. Patterson's expression softened slightly. "You were a hard worker, Clara, I'll give you that. She shook her head. "I hope you find what you're looking for out there." It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't even really kindness. But it was something close to human, and Clara would take it. Silas was waiting outside with 2 horses, his massive stallion, and a smaller mare with gentle eyes. He'd secured a travois to the mare's saddle, loaded with supplies and furs. "Ready?" he asked. Clara looked back at Patterson's boarding house one last time. 3 years of her life contained in that building. 3 years of exhaustion and humiliation and small grinding miseries, but also 3 years of survival. of learning her own strength, of becoming someone who could stand in a church and tell a preacher he was wrong. "I'm ready," she said. Silas helped her onto the mare, then mounted his own horse. As they started down Main Street, Clara was aware of faces in windows, people stopping on the boardwalk to stare. She caught a glimpse of Jake Holloway outside the saloon, his face twisted with something between anger and confusion. Saw Mrs. Morrison standing in front of the general store, her mouth pressed into a thin line of disapproval. Let them stare. Let them judge. She was leaving, and their opinions couldn't follow where she was going. They rode through town in silence, the horses' hooves clopping against the packed earth. As they reached the edge of Broken Ridge, where the last buildings gave way to wilderness, Clara felt something release in her chest, a tension she'd carried for so long she'd forgotten it was there. "You all right?" Silas asked, glancing over at her. Clara took a deep breath of cold, clean air. Ahead of them, the mountains rose against the sky, vast and wild and free. Behind her, everything she'd ever known was fading into memory. "Yes," she said, and meant it. "I'm all right." They rode north, following a trail that wound through pine forests and across high meadows, turning gold with autumn grass. Silas set a steady pace, not too fast, but not dawdling either. He seemed to know exactly where he was going, navigating by landmarks, invisible to Clara's untrained eyes. A particular rock formation, a distinctive tree, the way the shadows fell across the land. "How far is your cabin?" Clara asked after an hour of riding. 3 days if the weather holds, 2.5 if we push hard, but there's no need." Silas pointed to a line of dark clouds gathering on the northern horizon. "Storm's coming, though. We'll need to find shelter by tomorrow night." Clara felt a flutter of nervousness. She'd never spent a night outdoors, never been more than a mile from town. The wilderness stretching around them was beautiful, but alien, full of dangers she couldn't even imagine. As if reading her thoughts, Silas said, "You'll be fine. I know every cave and overhang between here and home, and I've got supplies enough to keep us comfortable." They stopped for lunch beside a stream, so clear Clara could see every pebble on the bottom. Silas built a small fire and made coffee, while Clara unpacked the food she'd prepared: cold biscuits, strips of dried venison, and wedges of hard cheese. "You'll need to learn to shoot," Silas said as they ate, "and track and read weather and a dozen other skills. The mountains don't forgive ignorance." "I'm a fast learner," Clara said. "I know. I've been watching how you work. You've got good hands and a sharp mind. You'll do fine once you adjust." They finished eating and continued riding. The trail grew steeper, winding up into hills covered with pine and aspen. The air grew thinner, colder. Clara's legs ached from the unaccustomed riding, but she didn't complain. This was her choice, her path. She would meet it without whining. As the sun began to sink toward the western peaks, Silas led them to a sheltered spot beneath an outcropping of rock. "We'll camp here tonight," he said. Clara slid off the mare with a groan she couldn't quite suppress. Every muscle in her body was screaming. Silas chuckled as he unsaddled the horses. "First day's always the hardest. Tomorrow will be worse, but after that your body will adjust." "That's not very comforting," Clara muttered. "Wasn't meant to be. Just truth." While Silas tended to the horses and gathered firewood, Clara explored their camp. The rock overhang created a natural shelter, blocking the wind and providing a roof of sorts. The ground beneath it was dry and relatively flat. Not comfortable by any civilized standard, but better than being exposed to the elements. Silas built a fire and showed Clara how to arrange the stones to maximize heat while minimizing smoke. Then he produced a blackened coffee pot and a frying pan from his pack, along with bacon, beans, and flour. "Can you make biscuits without a proper oven?" he asked. "I can try." She did more than try. Working with the simple ingredients and rudimentary tools, Clara produced biscuits that were golden and flaky bacon that was crisp but not burned, and beans seasoned with wild herbs Silas had gathered. They ate sitting cross-legged by the fire, the food tasting better than anything Clara could remember making in Mrs. Patterson's fancy kitchen. "This is good," Silas said, sopping up bean juice with his biscuit. "Really good. You weren't exaggerating about your skills." Clara felt a flush of pride. "Thank you." After dinner, as the fire burned down to coals and stars began to emerge overhead, Silas taught Clara how to arrange her bedroll for maximum warmth. He showed her how to use the saddles as windbreaks, how to position herself to stay warm without getting too close to the fire. I'll take first watch, he said. You sleep. Tomorrow's another long day. Clara burrowed into her bedroll, pulling old Thomas's blanket up to her chin. The ground was hard beneath her, the air cold on her face, and she could hear strange sounds in the darkness. Animal calls, the rustle of wind through trees, the crack of branches. She should have been terrified. She should have been miserable. Instead, lying there under more stars than she'd ever seen breathing air that tasted like pine and freedom, Clara felt something she'd almost forgotten the name for. Hope. She slept deeply despite the hard ground and woke to the smell of coffee and bacon. Silas had let her sleep while he prepared breakfast, and the sun was already well up when she emerged from her bedroll. Morning, he said, handing her a tin cup of coffee. How'd you sleep? Better than I expected. Clara accepted the cup gratefully, wrapping her cold hands around its warmth. Thank you for letting me rest. You needed it. Today's going to be harder than yesterday. He wasn't lying. The trail grew steeper, rockier, harder to navigate. Clara's sore muscles protested every movement, and more than once she had to grit her teeth against groans of pain. But she kept going, kept pushing, kept proving to herself that she was strong enough for this. They stopped frequently so Silas could point out landmarks, teach her about the terrain. He showed her how to identify poisonous plants, where to find water, how to read animal tracks in the mud. Clara absorbed it all, filing away every piece of information as if her life might depend on it. Because it might. Around midday, the storm Silas had predicted rolled in. The sky darkened to pewter and rain began to fall cold and relentless. Within minutes, Clara was soaked through, her dress clinging to her body, water running down her face. There's a cave about a mile ahead, Silas shouted over the wind. We'll wait out the worst of it there. That mile was the longest of Clara's life. The rain turned the trail to mud, making the horses skittish and the footing treacherous. Lightning split the sky, thunder rolling across the mountains like the voice of an angry god. Clara's teeth chattered so hard she bit her tongue, tasting blood. But finally she saw it. A dark opening in the hillside, large enough for the horses and deep enough to provide real shelter. Silas led them inside and immediately began stripping the wet gear from the horses, rubbing them down with handfuls of dry grass he'd found deeper in the cave. Get out of those wet clothes, he ordered Clara. There's a spare shirt and pants in my pack. Put those on and wrap yourself in the blankets. Hypothermia will kill you faster than anything else out here. Clara's hands shook so badly she could barely manage the buttons on her dress. Her fingers felt like blocks of ice, clumsy and numb. Silas turned his back to give her privacy while he built a fire near the cave entrance using tinder he'd kept dry in an oilskin pouch. She peeled off the soaked dress and undergarments, standing naked in the cave for a mortifying moment before pulling on Silas's spare clothes. The shirt hung to her knees. The pants had to be rolled up at the ankles, but they were dry and warm from being packed in the center of his gear. I'm decent, she said through chattering teeth. Silas turned and assessed her critically. Still too cold. Come here. He settled her by the growing fire and wrapped both blankets around her, then handed her a metal flask. Whiskey. Just a sip, it'll help warm you from the inside. The whiskey burned going down, but he was right. Within moments, Clara felt warmth spreading through her chest. The shaking began to subside. Better, Silas asked. Better, she confirmed. Thank you. He nodded and turned back to the fire, feeding it carefully until it was blazing strong. Outside, the storm raged on rain, hammering against the stone wind, howling like a living thing. But inside the cave, they were dry and warm and safe. Silas made coffee and heated up strips of jerky until they were soft enough to chew comfortably. They ate in silence, listening to the storm, watching the fire paint shadows on the cave walls. I've been thinking, Silas said eventually, about the arrangement, about making things proper. Clara's heart stuttered. Proper. When we get to the cabin, I'll build you your own room. Not just a curtain or a corner, a real room with a door and a lock. Your space, completely separate from mine. He poked at the fire with a stick. I want you to feel safe, to know that my offer was exactly what I said, a job, nothing more. Relief and something that might have been disappointment warred in Clara's chest. I appreciate that. And if anyone asks when we come down to trade or sell goods, we tell them the truth. You're my housekeeper, my employee, nothing inappropriate. Nothing that would damage your reputation more than it's already been damaged by coming with me. Does my reputation matter up there in the mountains? Silas met her eyes across the fire. It might matter to you. It might matter if you ever want to leave, start over somewhere else. I won't be the reason you can't build a life for yourself. Clara pulled the blankets tighter around her shoulders. You're a good man, Silas Grayborn, despite what people say. I'm a practical man. There's a difference. But he smiled slightly, taking the edge off the words. Now get some rest. We'll wait out the storm and continue tomorrow morning. Clara lay down by the fire, exhausted beyond measure. Her body ached. She was wearing a man's clothes in a cave in the wilderness, and she had no idea what the future held. But she'd made a choice. She'd chosen herself. Chosen possibility over certainty, chosen the chance at a life over the guarantee of survival. As sleep pulled her under, Clara's last thought was that even if this all went horribly wrong, even if she regretted everything, at least she would have tried. At least she would have been brave. The storm had passed by morning, leaving the world scrubbed clean and glittering with moisture. Clara woke to find Silas already up the horses, saddled, and a simple breakfast of coffee and hardtack waiting by the rekindled fire. Her muscles screamed in protest as she sat up. Every part of her body that could ache did ache in ways she hadn't known were possible. Even her hair hurt. Here, Silas handed her the coffee without comment on her obvious discomfort. Drink this, eat something, and we'll move slow this morning. Your body needs time to adjust. They rode out as the sun broke over the eastern peaks, painting the wet rocks and trees in shades of gold and amber. The trail was muddy from the rain, but passable, winding higher into the mountains with each passing hour. Clara focused on staying upright in the saddle, on breathing through the pain, on not complaining. Around midday, the landscape changed. The dense pine forest gave way to high alpine meadows, vast expanses of grass and wildflowers stretching between towering peaks. The air was so thin and clear that Clara could see for what felt like 100 miles. It was beautiful in a way that made her chest ache. We're close now, Silas said, pointing to a valley nestled between two mountains. Another hour, and you'll see the cabin. That hour felt eternal and instantaneous at once. Clara's anticipation built with each step the mare took, her nervousness growing alongside her excitement. This was it. This was the place she'd be living, the life she'd chosen. What if the cabin was horrible? What if she couldn't stand the isolation? What if she'd made a terrible mistake? But then they crested a ridge, and Clara forgot every doubt she'd ever had. The valley below was perfect. A small lake reflected the sky like polished silver, surrounded by meadow grass that would be green in summer but was now turning gold with autumn. A creek fed into the lake from the northern end, its water so clear she could see it sparkle even from this distance. And there, on a slight rise overlooking the lake, stood the cabin. It was larger than Clara had expected, built from thick logs chinked with mud and moss. Smoke rose from a stone chimney, which confused her until she realized Silas must have someone checking on it while he was gone. The roof was covered in split shingles, and there was a covered porch running along the front. It's beautiful, Clara breathed. It's home, Silas said simply. Come on, I'll show you around. They rode down into the valley as the sun began its descent toward the western peaks. As they drew closer, Clara could see the details Silas had put into his home. The windows had real glass, not just oiled paper. There was a small barn behind the cabin and what looked like a smokehouse. A vegetable garden, now brown and dormant for winter, occupied a sunny patch near the creek. An old man emerged from the cabin as they approached, waving a gnarled hand in greeting. He was native, his face weathered as old leather, his long gray hair bound in a braid. "Silas," he called out, "you're back early. Storm must have pushed you hard." "Joseph." Silas dismounted and clasped the old man's arm in greeting. "How have things been?" "Quiet. Boring. The way I like it." Joseph's dark eyes shifted to Clara, assessing her with a single glance. "You brought company." "This is Clara Whitmore." "Clara, this is Joseph Running Bear. He checks on the place when I'm gone, makes sure no bears have moved into my bed." Joseph's lined face creased into a smile. "Welcome, Clara Whitmore. Any friend of Silas is welcome in this valley." "She's not a friend," Silas said, and Clara's heart dropped until he continued. "She's my new business partner. going to help me run this place properly, make it more than just a survival shelter. About time, Joseph said. I've been telling you for years you need help. Place is too much for one person. He helped them unload the horses while Silas showed Clara inside. The cabin's interior was dim until Silas lit several oil lamps, revealing a single large room divided into functional spaces. A massive stone fireplace dominated one wall with a cooking area built into it. There was a rough table with 4 chairs, a rocking chair near the hearth, and a bed tucked in the far corner. Furs and blankets were piled on the bed, and herbs hung drying from the rafters. It smelled of wood smoke leather and something wild Clara couldn't name. It's not much, Silas said, watching her face, but it's solid, warm, the roof doesn't leak, and the walls keep out the wind. It's wonderful, Clara said honestly. After her tiny attic room at Mrs. Patterson's, this space felt enormous. But where will I sleep? That's the project for tomorrow. I'll start building your room off the back wall. For tonight you take the bed. I'll sleep out here by the fire. I couldn't. You can and you will. Silas's tone left no room for argument. You're exhausted, sore, and you need proper rest. Besides, I've slept in worse places than in front of my own hearth. Joseph stayed for dinner, which Clara insisted on cooking despite her exhaustion. She found Silas's supplies well organized but limited flour, cornmeal, salt pork, dried beans, coffee, and not much else. She made do producing a simple but hearty stew and fresh cornbread cooked in a Dutch oven nestled in the fireplace coals. This is the best meal this cabin has ever seen, Joseph declared, sopping up stew with his cornbread. Silas, you'd better treat this woman well, or I'll steal her for my own cabin. You don't have a cabin, Silas pointed out. You live in that cave 2 valleys over. I'd build a cabin for cooking like this. The easy banter between the 2 men was comfortable, worn smooth by years of friendship. Clara learned that Joseph had known Silas since his first winter in the mountains, had taught him how to survive in this harsh country, had been the closest thing to family Silas had up here. How'd you end up in these mountains? Clara asked Joseph as they finished eating. Long story, the old man said. Short version is, I got tired of watching my people pushed onto worse and worse land. Decided if I was going to be poor and cold, I'd rather do it in a place I chose. He smiled, but there was old pain in his eyes. These mountains don't care what color your skin is or what language you speak. They'll kill you or let you live based on your skills and luck, nothing else. That's more fairness than I ever found among men. Clara understood that sentiment more than she could say. After Joseph left, promising to return in a few days to help with the room construction, Silas showed Clara how to bank the fire for the night, where the water bucket stood, where to find the chamber pot, and the outdoor privy. It's not civilized, he said, almost apologetically, but it works. It's more than I had, Clara said. Thank you, Silas, for all of this. He nodded, uncomfortable with gratitude as always. Get some rest. Tomorrow we start teaching you how to live up here. Clara collapsed into the bed, which was surprisingly comfortable with its thick mattress stuffed with pine needles and furs. She pulled the heavy blankets up to her chin and let exhaustion pull her under the sounds of Silas moving quietly around the cabin, a strange but comforting lullaby. She woke to pale dawn light filtering through the window and the smell of coffee. Silas was already up, dressed, and clearly ready to start the day. Morning, he said when he saw her stirring. Get dressed and eat something. We've got work to do. The next weeks passed in a blur of learning and labor. Silas was true to his word about teaching Clara mountain skills, but he was a demanding teacher. He expected her to pay attention, to remember what he showed her, to practice until she got it right. He taught her to shoot, starting with tin cans lined up on a fallen log and gradually moving to actual hunting. Clara's first kill was a rabbit, and she cried while helping Silas dress it, mourning the small life she'd taken. But she ate the meat that night and understood the fundamental truth of this place. Everything came with a cost, and honest living meant accepting that cost without flinching. He taught her to read the weather by watching the sky, the behavior of animals, the way the wind moved through the trees. Taught her which plants were edible and which would kill her. Showed her how to preserve meat by smoking and salting, how to make pemmican that would last all winter, how to render fat for candles and soap. Joseph came most days, helping Silas build the addition to the cabin. The work was hard and slow, but gradually the structure took shape. A room about 10 feet by 12 with its own window and a door that could be barred from the inside. Clara helped when she could, learning to handle tools to measure and cut and fit pieces together. "You're building this well," she observed one afternoon, watching Silas carefully chink the gaps between logs. "Like it's meant to last a lifetime." "It is," he said simply. "When you build in the mountains, you build for keeps. No sense doing half work up here." The room was finished by early November, and Clara moved her meager possessions into it with a sense of pride she'd never felt about any space before. This was hers. She'd helped build it with her own hands. Nobody could take it from her or make her feel unwelcome in it. She made it beautiful in small ways. Hung herbs from the rafters to dry and scent the air. Sewed curtains from fabric Silas had in his supplies. Arranged her few belongings, her mother's Bible. Old Thomas's blanket, the clothes she'd brought with care and attention. It wasn't much, but it was hers. The rhythm of mountain life settled over her like a familiar coat. Rise before dawn. Start the fire, make coffee and breakfast. Spend the morning on whatever task needed doing, processing meat, mending clothes, gathering firewood, checking the snares Silas had taught her to set. Afternoon was for larger projects or hunting. Evening was for cooking, eating, and sitting by the fire while Silas carved or repaired tools and Clara sewed or worked on tanning hides. They talked during those evening hours, sharing pieces of their pasts. Silas told her more about Sarah, about their brief, happy years together, about the guilt he carried for not seeing how sick she was until too late. Clara told him about her childhood, about losing her parents, about the succession of relatives who'd made her feel like a burden. "You know what the worst part was?" Clara said one night, her hands busy with a shirt she was mending. "It wasn't the cruelty. I could handle cruelty. It was the kindness that came with conditions. We'll feed you if you work hard enough. We'll keep you if you're grateful enough. We'll tolerate you if you make yourself small enough. Every kindness was a debt I could never fully repay." "That's not kindness," Silas said. "That's manipulation. Real kindness doesn't keep score." "Is that what this is?" Clara looked up at him. "Real kindness. This is partnership. I need help running this place. You needed a way out of that town. We're both getting something out of the arrangement." He met her eyes across the fire. "But yes, I suppose it's kindness too. The real kind. The kind that doesn't keep score." Winter came early that year, sweeping down from the high peaks in a fury of snow and wind. The first big storm hit in mid-November, dropping 3 feet of snow in 2 days and trapping them in the cabin. Clara had never experienced anything like it. The howling wind, the snow so thick you couldn't see 10 feet beyond the windows, the bitter cold that seeped through every crack despite the roaring fire. But the cabin held. Silas's careful construction kept them warm and dry, and the supplies they'd spent weeks preparing kept them fed. Clara cooked elaborate meals partly out of necessity and partly out of boredom, creating dishes from their limited ingredients that made Silas shake his head in wonder. "How do you make salt pork and beans taste like this?" he asked one evening, eating a stew she'd seasoned with dried herbs and wild onions. "Hunger is the best seasoning," Clara said. "But creativity helps." During the long storm-bound days, Clara realized something that both comforted and frightened her. She was happy. Genuinely, deeply happy in a way she'd never been before. The work was hard. The conditions were harsh. The isolation was nearly total. But she woke up each morning without dread. She went through her days without the constant weight of judgment and mockery. She fell asleep each night feeling accomplished, useful, valued. She'd never felt valued before. One afternoon, while the wind howled outside and they were both working on indoor tasks, Clara caught Silas watching her with an odd expression. When she met his eyes, he didn't look away. "What?" she asked. "You've changed," he said. "Since we left town. You stand different. Move different, like you're not apologizing for taking up space anymore." Clara set down the butter churn she'd been working. "I feel different, stronger. Not just my body, though. That's changed too from all the work, but inside, like I'm becoming someone I was always supposed to be." "Good," Silas said. "That's good." Something in his tone made Clara's heart skip. She'd been trying not to notice how handsome he was when he smiled, how capable his hands were, how safe she felt in his presence. This was a business arrangement, nothing more. She couldn't afford to confuse gratitude with anything deeper, but it was getting harder to maintain that distinction. The storm finally broke after 5 days, revealing a world transformed. Everything was buried under snow, the familiar landscape rendered strange and beautiful. Silas immediately began the work of digging out clearing paths to the barn, checking on the horses, making sure their meat cache was still secure. Clara helped, learning to move through deep snow, to recognize the danger of ice, to pace herself in the thin, cold air. Her body had grown stronger over the past months, her softness now underlaid with real muscle from the constant physical work. She could split wood, now could carry water buckets that would have defeated her in September, could hike for hours without feeling like her lungs would burst. December arrived with more snow and shorter days. The sun barely cleared the southern peaks before beginning its descent, leaving them in twilight by mid-afternoon. Clara learned to work by lamplight, to make the most of the brief, bright hours, to find comfort in the long, dark evenings. It was during one of those long evenings that everything changed. They were sitting by the fire as usual, Silas repairing a harness, and Clara working on a new shirt for him. The wind outside was gentle tonight, just a whisper against the windows. The fire crackled and popped, and somewhere in the distance a wolf howled. "Clara," Silas said suddenly, "I need to ask you something." She looked up from her sewing. "All right. Are you happy here? Truly happy? Not just grateful or making the best of things, but actually content?" The question surprised her. "Yes," she said without hesitation. "More than I ever thought possible. Why?" Silas set down the harness and leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. "Because I've been thinking about the arrangement, about what happens come spring." Clara's stomach dropped. Was he going to send her away? Had she done something wrong? "I know I said you could leave in the spring if you wanted," Silas continued. "Go start fresh somewhere else with the money you've saved. That offer still stands, but I'm hoping you won't take it." "You want me to stay." "I want you to stay permanently. Not as an employee, but as—" He stopped, seeming to struggle with the words. "As a partner. A real partner. 50-50 in everything. The cabin, the trap line, the trade goods, all of it." Clara's hands had stilled on the fabric. "Why?" "Because you've worked as hard as I have. Contributed as much. This place runs better with both of us here." He paused. "And because I don't want to go back to being alone." There was something in his voice, some vulnerability that made Clara's breath catch. "Silas, I'm not asking for anything you're not willing to give," he said quickly. "The separate rooms stay. The boundaries stay. I'm just asking if you'll make this place your permanent home instead of a temporary stop." Clara set down her sewing and stood moving to the window. Outside, moonlight painted the snow-covered valley in shades of silver and blue. This beautiful, harsh, honest place. This life she'd built with her own hands. "Yes," she said, turning back to face him. "Yes, I'll stay. Not just because it's a good offer, though it is, but because this is the first place I've ever felt like I belong. The first place I've been allowed to just be." Silas stood as well, and for a moment they just looked at each other across the firelit room. Then he crossed to her in 3 long strides and pulled her into a hug that was fierce and brief and spoke volumes about things neither of them was ready to name. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for taking a chance on this crazy mountain man." "Thank you for seeing me," Clara replied, "for recognizing I was worth more than what the world told me I was." They broke apart, both a little embarrassed by the intensity of the moment. Silas cleared his throat and moved back to his chair. Clara returned to hers. They picked up their tasks and worked in comfortable silence, but something fundamental had shifted between them. This was home now. Not temporary, not conditional. Home. The winter deepened, and with it came both hardships and joys Clara had never imagined. A January blizzard that lasted 9 days and had them worried about running out of firewood. A February thaw that turned the valley into a muddy mess and made Clara laugh at the absurdity of being cold and wet at the same time. March brought what Silas called the hunger moon, when game was scarce and supplies ran low and they had to carefully ration everything. But there was beauty too, northern lights dancing across the sky in sheets of green and purple. The first crocuses pushing through the melting snow in April. A elk calf born near the lake, all spindly legs and enormous eyes. Joseph teaching Clara to weave baskets from willow branches during his visits. The way Silas smiled more often, now the hard lines around his eyes softening. And there was the growing awareness between them, unspoken but undeniable. The way Clara's heart jumped when Silas walked into a room, the way his hand would linger on her shoulder when he passed behind her chair, the careful distance they maintained, both aware that crossing certain lines would change everything. It was early May when the trappers arrived. Clara was working in the garden planting the seeds they'd saved from last year when she heard horses. 5 riders crested the ridge and rode down into the valley, rough men with hard eyes and harder faces. Silas emerged from the barn, his rifle held casually in his hands. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" The lead rider was a big man with a scarred face and mean eyes. "We're heading north to the Beaver Streams. Heard there was a cabin in this valley where we might trade for supplies." "You heard wrong," Silas said evenly. "I don't trade with strangers." "That's not very neighborly." The scarred man's eyes found Clara in the garden. "And who's this pretty lady?" Clara stood slowly, recognizing the tone in his voice. She'd heard it before in town from men who looked at women and saw only objects to use or mock. Her hand moved to the knife at her belt. Silas had given it to her and taught her to use it, but she didn't draw it. "Not yet." "That's my business partner," Silas said, and his voice had gone cold. "And you do well to address her with respect." "Business partner." The scarred man, Jeb Crow, one of his companions had called him, grinned unpleasantly. "That what they're calling it these days seems to me a woman that size would be good for certain kinds of business." He didn't finish the sentence. Silas moved faster than Clara had ever seen him move, covering the distance between them in a heartbeat. He grabbed Crow by his coat and yanked him from the saddle, the rifle never wavering from the other men. "You've got 2 choices," Silas said quietly. "You apologize to the lady, turn around and ride out of my valley, or I break your jaw and then you ride out. Either way, you're leaving." Crow's hand moved toward his gun, but Silas pressed the rifle barrel against his throat. "Don't. I've killed better men than you for less reason." The tension stretched thin as wire. Clara's heart hammered, but she stood her ground, her hand still on her knife. She wouldn't cower. Not anymore. Not ever again. One of the other trappers, younger than Crow, but no less rough, spoke up. "Jeb, let it go. There's other places to get supplies." Crow's face was red with rage and humiliation, but he was smart enough to recognize when he was outmatched. All right, I apologize." "Not to me." Silas nodded toward Clara. "To her." Crow spat the words like poison. "Sorry, ma'am." Silas released him and stepped back, the rifle still ready. "Now go. And if I hear you've been spreading stories about this place or the woman who lives here, I'll come find you, and I won't be as polite next time." The trappers left at a gallop, Crow's fury evident in every line of his body. When they disappeared over the ridge, Clara let out a breath she didn't know she'd been holding. "You all right?" Silas asked, coming over to her. "I'm fine." "You—" "Fine." He looked at her with something like pride. "You didn't run. You stood your ground." "I learned from the best," Clara said. "Besides, this is my home now. I'm not going to let men like that make me feel small in my own home." Silas smiled, and it was the most beautiful thing Clara had ever seen. That night, neither of them could sleep. Clara lay in her room listening to Silas moving restlessly in the main cabin, the creak of floorboards marking his pacing. Finally, she rose and wrapped a shawl around her shoulders, padding barefoot to her door. Silas stood at the window, staring out at the moonlit valley. He turned when he heard her approach, his face shadowed and troubled. "I'm sorry about today," he said. "Men like Crow, they're part of why I left civilization. The casual cruelty, the way they think they can say anything, do anything because they've got numbers and weapons on their side." "You protected me," Clara said quietly. "Just like you did in town. You always protect me." "It's not enough." Silas's hands clenched into fists. "I can stand between you and men like that, but I can't change what they think, what they'll say when they leave here. By tomorrow night, there will be stories spreading through every trading post and saloon between here and Canada about the fat woman living in sin with the mountain man, about how you must be desperate, how I must be using you. They'll make something ugly out of something good. Clara moved closer to the window, standing beside him. Let them talk. I learned something this winter, Silas. I learned that other people's opinions only have the power I give them, and I'm done giving them power. But it affects you. Your reputation, your future. My future is here. Clara turned to face him. You asked me to stay permanently, and I said yes. I meant it. This valley, this cabin, this life, it's mine now, ours. Whatever stories people tell can't change that. Silas looked at her, really looked at her in the moonlight streaming through the window. You've become so strong, he said, wonder in his voice. Not just physically, though, that too, but inside. The woman who stood in that garden today with her hand on her knife, she's not the same woman who cooked breakfast in Mrs. Patterson's kitchen. No, Clara agreed. She's not. That woman was afraid of everything. Afraid of taking up space, of asking for what she needed, of believing she deserved happiness. This woman knows better. This woman, Silas said quietly, is magnificent. The word hung between them heavy with meaning. Clara's breath caught. They'd been so careful all winter maintaining their boundaries, keeping things proper and professional. But something had been building between them, undeniable as the turning of seasons. Silas, Clara whispered, what are we doing? I don't know. He reached up and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, his rough fingers gentle against her skin. I told myself this was just business, that I was offering you a job, nothing more, that I was being noble, helping someone who needed help. And now I think I was lying to both of us. His hand lingered near her face. When I saw Crow looking at you today, speaking to you that way, I wanted to kill him. Not just stop him or drive him off, but actually end his life for daring to disrespect you. That's not a business partner's reaction, Clara. That's something else entirely. Clara's heart was racing so fast she could hardly breathe. What do you want, Silas, from me from this? What do you actually want? He was quiet for a long moment, his storm-gray eyes searching hers. I want you to stay, not just in this valley, but in my life. I want to wake up every morning knowing you're here. I want to build something with you, something that goes beyond business partnerships and separate rooms. He paused, vulnerability clear in his face. I want to stop pretending that sharing a cabin with you is enough, when what I really want is to share a life. Tears burned in Clara's eyes. You're talking about marriage. If you'd have me. I know I'm not much of a catch, rough, hard to live with, better with animals than people most days. I know there are younger men, handsomer men who could give you easier lives. But I can promise you this. I will spend every day of my life making sure you know you're valued, respected, loved. The last word fell like a stone into still water ripples spreading outward. Loved, Clara repeated. Yes. Silas took both her hands in his. I love you, Clara Whitmore. I think I started loving you the night I walked into that saloon and saw you cleaning up their mess with your head held high despite everything. I just didn't know it yet. Clara felt tears spilling down her cheeks. I'm afraid. Of what? Of believing this is real. Of trusting that someone could actually love me, not despite what I look like, but just love me. All of me. Without conditions or expectations or hidden costs. Her voice broke. I've never been loved before, Silas. Not like that. Not the real kind. What if I don't know how? Silas pulled her close, wrapping his arms around her in an embrace that was fierce and tender at once. Then we'll learn together. I'm not good at this either, Clara. Sarah and I, we were young and it was easy. This is different. We're both broken people who've been told we're not good enough, not worthy enough, too much of this or not enough of that. But maybe that's exactly why we fit. Clara buried her face in his chest, breathing in the familiar scent of pine and wood smoke and safety. I love you too, she whispered. I think I've loved you since you made me eat that sandwich, since you looked at me like I was a person instead of a problem. But I was afraid to admit it, afraid that wanting more would ruin what we already had. Nothing's ruined. Silas cupped her face in his hands, tilting it up so he could see her eyes. Everything's just beginning. But Clara, I need you to understand something. If we do this, if we marry, it's not because I'm rescuing you or because you owe me anything. It's because we choose each other. Equal partners in everything. No debts, no obligations. Just two people building a life together. Equal partners, Clara said, and felt the truth of it settle into her bones. In everything. In everything, Silas confirmed. Then, slowly giving her every chance to pull away, he lowered his head and kissed her. It was Clara's first kiss, and it was nothing like she'd imagined in the secret dreams she'd hardly admitted to herself. It wasn't dramatic or sweeping or world-shaking. It was gentle and sweet and real tasting of coffee and promise and home. When they pulled apart, both of them were smiling. "We should do this properly," Silas said. "Get a preacher up here, have Joseph stand witness, make it legal and official so no one can question it." "How?" "The nearest preacher is in Broken Ridge, and I'm not going back there. There's a circuit preacher who travels through the high country come summer, usually passes through in June. We could ask him to perform the ceremony." Silas grinned. "Though we might want to wait until closer to the date to tell Joseph. He'll never let me hear the end of it knowing he was right about us all along." Clara laughed, feeling lighter than air. He knew. Of course he knew. Everyone knew except us. They stayed up the rest of the night talking, making plans, dreaming about the future. They would expand the garden, maybe build a greenhouse to extend the growing season. They'd increase the trapline cure, more hides to sell. Maybe even build a second cabin, eventually something they could rent to hunters or travelers passing through. The possibilities stretched before them, vast and inviting as the valley itself. When dawn broke over the eastern peaks, they were still sitting together on the porch, wrapped in a blanket against the morning chill, watching the world wake up around them. "I never thought I'd have this," Clara said softly. "A home. A partner. A future that wasn't just survival." "Neither did I," Silas replied. "After Sarah died, I thought that part of my life was over, that I'd spend the rest of my days alone up here, and that would be enough. But it wasn't. I was just too afraid to admit I wanted more." Clara leaned her head on his shoulder. "We're both brave now." "Yes," he agreed. "We are." The weeks that followed were some of the happiest of Clara's life. They fell into a new rhythm, one that included stolen kisses while working in the garden, lingering touches while cooking dinner evenings spent sitting close by the fire. They still maintained separate rooms, Silas insisted on, that until they were properly married, but the walls between them had come down in every way that mattered. Joseph arrived in early June with the circuit preacher in tow, a weathered man named Reverend Matthews, who'd been riding through the mountains for 30 years. He took one look at Clara and Silas standing together on the porch and smiled. "Joseph said you two needed marrying," he said. "I can see he was right." The ceremony was planned for the following Sunday, giving them time to prepare. Clara had nothing resembling a wedding dress, but she spent the week sewing a new dress from the best fabric in Silas's supplies, a deep green cotton that brought out the color of her eyes. She added lace at the collar and cuffs details she'd never bothered with before, because what was the point of pretty things when you were already ugly? But she wasn't ugly. Standing in front of the small mirror Silas had hung in her room, Clara saw herself clearly for the first time in her life. She was large, yes, and round, and would never fit the world's narrow definition of beautiful. But she was strong, capable, healthy. Her face was clear and honest, her hands skilled and sure. She looked like a woman who could survive a mountain winter, who could stand up to bullies, who could love and be loved in return. She looked like herself. Finally, completely herself. The morning of the wedding dawned clear and perfect, the sky that particular shade of blue that only exists in high mountain country. Joseph and Reverend Matthews arrived early, and Joseph immediately began teasing Silas about his nervousness. "Never seen you this jumpy," the old man said, grinning. "Not even that time we got treed by that grizzly." "That was different," Silas muttered, adjusting his collar for the 10th time. He'd shaved his beard down to a neat trim and wore his best clothes, clean buckskins, and a shirt Clara had made him that actually fit properly. "That was life or death. This is just marriage." "Exactly," Joseph said, his eyes twinkling. "Life or death." Silas threw a pine cone at him. The ceremony took place in the meadow beside the lake. with the mountains standing witness and wildflowers nodding in the breeze. Clara wore her green dress and carried a bouquet of columbines Joseph had picked that morning. Silas stood waiting for her in his good clothes, and the look on his face when he saw her walking toward him made Clara's heart soar. Reverend Matthews kept the ceremony short and simple, speaking about partnership and respect and the sacred bond between two people who choose to face life together. When it came time for the vows, Silas took Clara's hands and spoke from the heart. "Clara, I promise to honor you, to respect you, to stand beside you as an equal partner in all things. I promise that your voice will always matter, your needs will always be considered, and your happiness will always be my concern. I promise to love you not despite who you are, but because of who you are strong and brave and good. I promise to spend every day of my life making sure you never doubt your worth again." Clara's turn came, and through her tears she spoke her own promises. "Silas, I promise to be your true partner, to share both the burdens and the joys of this life we're building. I promise to trust you with my heart, my hopes, my whole self. I promise to stand beside you in hard times and celebrate with you in good times. I promise to love you fiercely and honestly with all that I am and all that I'm still becoming." Reverend Matthews pronounced them married, and Silas kissed her there in the meadow with the mountains watching and Joseph whooping like a young man. It was perfect. It was real. It was home. They celebrated with a feast. Clara had spent days preparing venison roasted with wild herbs, fresh bread, early greens from the garden, dried berry pie made with last year's preserves. Joseph played a battered harmonica he'd produced from somewhere, and they danced in the meadow as the sun sank toward the peaks, painting everything gold and rose and purple. Later, after Joseph and Reverend Matthews had retired to the small tent they'd set up at the edge of the clearing, Silas and Clara stood together on their porch, looking out at their valley. "Mrs. Grayborn," Silas said, trying out the name. Clara smiled. "Mr. Grayborn. How does it feel?" "Like I've finally found the place I was always supposed to be." Clara turned to face him. "Thank you for seeing me, Silas, for recognizing that I was worth more than the world told me I was, for giving me the chance to become who I was meant to be." "You gave yourself that chance," Silas said. "You were the one brave enough to take it. I just held the door open." "Then thank you for holding the door." Clara reached up and touched his face, this man who had changed her life simply by treating her like a human being. "I love you. I love you too." Silas caught her hand and pressed a kiss to her palm. "Come on, wife. Let's start our life together." They went inside, closing the door on the world beyond their valley. Tomorrow they would return to work, to the endless tasks of mountain living. But tonight was theirs, a beginning, a promise, a future bright with possibility. The seasons turned as they always did, indifferent to human joy or sorrow. Summer ripened into autumn. Autumn froze into winter. Winter melted into spring again. The years passed, marked by hard work and small pleasures, by challenges met and overcome, by the steady accumulation of a life built on bedrock. Clara and Silas expanded their operation, building the greenhouse they'd dreamed of, adding to the trapline, cultivating a reputation for quality goods among the scattered traders and trappers who passed through the region. Word spread of the couple in the high valley, the mountain man and his capable wife, who ran their operation like a well-oiled machine. Some people still gossiped, still made assumptions about how Silas must have married Clara out of pity or desperation. But those whispers died when people met her, saw the way she handled a rifle, managed the business side of their trade, stood shoulder to shoulder with her husband in all things. Clara had become formidable, and even those inclined to judge found themselves choosing respect instead. Joseph became a regular fixture at their cabin, spending half his time in their valley and half in his cave. He taught Clara the old ways of tracking and stalking, of reading signs in nature, of moving through the wilderness like smoke. She absorbed it all, adding it to her growing store of knowledge about this place she called home. 3 years after their marriage, Clara woke one morning with a familiar queasiness. She'd been feeling strange for weeks, tired, emotional, her body doing things she didn't quite understand. When she missed her monthly courses for the second time, she began to suspect. She told Silas that evening as they sat by the fire. He went very still, his face unreadable. "A baby," he said finally. "I think so." I'm not certain, but all the signs are there. Clara's hand moved to her stomach. Are you? Is this? I know after Sarah. Don't. Silas crossed to her and knelt beside her chair, taking both her hands. Don't compare yourself to her or this to that. You're strong, Clara. Stronger than you know. If there's a baby coming, we'll face it together. And I'll make damn sure you rest, eat properly, and take care of yourself. No working yourself to death trying to prove you're not a burden. You sound like you've been thinking about this. I have been. Every month that passed, I wondered if it might happen. Hoped and feared at the same time. He pressed a kiss to her knuckles. But Clara, listen to me. Your health comes first. The baby's health comes second. Everything else, the trapline, the trade, the work, it can all wait or be done by me and Joseph. You are not negotiable. Tears streamed down Clara's face. I'm scared. I know, so am I. But we're brave, remember, both of us. The pregnancy progressed slowly through the long winter. Silas was true to his word, taking over most of the heavy work and insisting Clara rest whenever she showed signs of fatigue. Joseph moved into the valley for the duration, setting up in the small cabin they'd built for occasional visitors, providing both help and companionship. Clara's body changed in ways both wonderful and frightening. Her belly swelled, stretching skin that already bore the marks of a lifetime. She felt the baby move, small flutters at first, and then solid kicks that made her gasp. Some days she felt powerful like an earth goddess creating life. Other days she felt trapped, worried, terrified that something would go wrong. But Silas was always there, steady as the mountains themselves. He talked to her belly, sang to it in his rough voice, placed his big hands on her skin to feel the baby kick. He built a cradle from pine wood, sanding it smooth and carving small animals into the headboard. He made sure she ate well, rested, often stayed warm. The baby came in early May, arriving with the first real thaw. Clara's labor was long and hard, 18 hours of pain that left her exhausted and terrified. Joseph served as midwife, his old hands steady and sure, while Silas held Clara's hand and let her squeeze until his bones creaked. When the baby finally emerged wailing and red-faced and furious at the world, Clara started to cry. Not from pain, but from relief and joy and overwhelming love. A girl, Joseph announced, wrapping the baby in soft furs. A healthy, strong girl. Silas cut the cord with shaking hands. Then Joseph placed the baby on Clara's chest. She was perfect, small but solid, with a thick shock of dark hair and lungs that could wake the dead. "Hello, little one," Clara whispered. "Welcome home." They named her Sarah Rose, honoring the past while celebrating the present. Little Sarah was a force from her first breath, demanding loud, utterly certain of her right to exist. Clara watched her daughter nurse and felt something heal inside herself that she hadn't known was broken. This baby would never doubt her worth, would never be told she was too much or not enough, would grow up knowing she was loved without conditions, valued without qualifications. Clara and Silas would make sure of it. The years that followed brought more children, a boy they named Thomas Joseph, then twin girls named Margaret and Ruth. The cabin expanded again, growing to accommodate their growing family. The valley rang with laughter and arguments and the particular chaos that comes with children. Clara taught her daughters to be strong, to stand up for themselves, to never apologize for taking up space. Silas taught his son to be gentle, to respect women, to value people for who they were rather than what they looked like. Together they built a family that valued kindness over conformity, courage over comfort. Sometimes in the quiet moments after the children were asleep, Clara would stand on the porch and look out at the valley that had become her kingdom. She'd think about the young woman who'd cleaned dishes in Mrs. Patterson's kitchen, who'd believed every cruel thing the world said about her, who'd thought she'd never deserve love or happiness or a life of her own. That woman was gone. In her place was Clara, gray-born wife and mother and partner, strong and capable and whole. She'd built this life with her own hands, made these choices with her own courage. The world had tried to make her small, and she'd chosen to be vast instead. One autumn evening, 15 years after she'd first ridden out of Broken Ridge, Clara and Silas sat together on the porch while their children played in the meadow below. The sun was setting, painting the mountains in shades of fire, and the air smelled of pine and coming snow. "Do you ever regret it?" Silas asked. leaving civilization. Choosing this hard life. Clara thought about it seriously, then shook her head. Not once. Not ever. This life gave me everything that mattered. Freedom, purpose, love. What would I go back to? A world that measured me by my dress size instead of my character. Some people would say you gave up a lot. Comfort, society, safety. I gave up nothing I valued and gained everything I needed. Clara took his hand, their fingers intertwining naturally after years of practice. We did this, Silas, together. Two broken people who the world threw away, and we built something beautiful from the wreckage. Equal partners, Silas said. Equal partners, Clara confirmed. In everything. Down in the meadow, Sarah called out that she'd found a nest of rabbits. Thomas wanted to keep them as pets. The twins were arguing about whose turn it was to help with dinner. Normal chaos, normal life, beautifully and perfectly normal. Silas pulled Clara close and she leaned into him, watching their children play in the golden light. This was her life. This valley, this man, these children, this hard-won happiness built on bedrock of mutual respect and honest love. The world had told her she was nobody, that no one would want her love, her choose her. The world had been wrong. And every day in this hidden valley high in the mountains, Clara Grayborn proved it.